I am calling in today from the montane region of Colorado, which is the traditional territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, and actually supports relationships and very important ties to more than 50 contemporary tribes. And at CU Boulder, we are taking our role in truth and reconciliation really seriously, including with the formation of the Navigating the New Arctic Community Hub Office, which will partially sit here at CU Boulder. So today, I'm hoping actually to engage you in a topic that we can continue afterwards about the importance of ecological legacies. I am an ecologist. I tend to think about variation through both time and space. And I think ecologists often get overwhelmed by spatial complexity. And I want to think a little bit about the time gradient today. First, I want to define for you what I mean by legacies. Legacies are really important in almost any kind of ecosystem, from marine to freshwater to terrestrial and all around our planet. But I think they play a special role in northern ecosystems, and I want to talk about that today. There's a lot of different types of legacies, and I might just ask, if you haven't muted yourself, can you please go ahead and do that, just so I can take the floor. So legacies really are any situation where the past really dictates the present, right? So if you need to understand a past legacy of deposition or biological information, that falls into this category of legacy. And there's been some wonderful work, defining these different types of legacies and outlining their role in different kinds of ecosystems. And this kind of conceptual work has really made me think about the role of things that I love to study, these material legacies that represent historic accumulation of biomass productivity that gets locked away in ecosystems, largely representing carbon deposition in peat or permafrost sediments. These are really important material legacies. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today in terms of how we understand climate ecosystem interactions. So let me start by just defining for you what is permafrost, just so we're all on the same page. This is probably familiar to many of you, but permafrost is a term that often gets bantered in the media. And I just like to spend a little bit of time noting that permafrost is very diverse and can have really different surface expressions as it responds to disturbance. Permafrost is any earth material that remains frozen for consecutive years, and it can represent a variety of earth materials. So we're talking about frozen sand or frozen organic matter or frozen rock, for example, dominating many places of the eastern Canadian Arctic. Permafrost is always subsurface, which makes it a really fascinating, component of the Earth system to study. We can't remotely sense or even measure permafrost directly from the land surface. We need to dig down, drill down, or use proxies of change that are expressed in the active layer, which is that layer of Earth surface that thaws and freezes seasonally that sits on top of that permafrost. So if we, especially speaking as an ecologist, if we want to study permafrost change, we need to get very intimate with relationships between active layer dynamics at the surface and what's going on underneath. So the fact that permafrost is subsurface makes it a challenging topic, but a very interesting one to study. Permafrost forms different regions or zones. I'm just going to show Alaska here as an example. As we think about the far north of Alaska, we tend to refer to continuous permafrost as very climate-driven permafrost. This is cold permafrost. It's very thick in its, where it's found all across the landscape in its continuous form. But as you move further south, into the taiga regions and down into boreal zones, we move out of the continuous permafrost zone into discontinuous, and then further south into sporadic or even isolated permafrost. Here, permafrost is patchy. It can be younger than the older permafrost found further north. So some of the permafrost peatlands that I work in, permafrost formed only a few hundred years ago in the North American Little Ice Age. So we can have very young, thin, and patchy permafrost that lends itself to us describing this kind of permafrost as ecosystem protected permafrost. Because of that patchy nature, permafrost patches are interacting with vegetation, with hydrology. And in fact, what is present at the surface of the ecosystems really dictate where permafrost is found and how resilient that permafrost can be to disturbances like land use or wildfire. So this is the permafrost I tend to be really fascinated with. It is intimately connected with peat distributions because thick peat layers really protect permafrost. And in fact, most isolated permafrost is only found in peatlands at the very southern limit of permafrost distributions, at least here in North America. From a climate lens, we care about permafrost because permafrost represents maybe not the largest carbon pool in the Earth system, but it is a large carbon pool that is in dynamic exchange with the atmosphere. So permafrost stores more carbon, again, locking away this ancient biomass for many millennia. Today, permafrost certainly stores more carbon than global vegetation. And our best estimates or latest estimates show that permafrost stores about twice as much carbon as is contained in the atmosphere. And again, there's a dynamic exchange between that permafrost carbon pool and the Earth's atmosphere. We also care from a climate lens about permafrost because we know permafrost is warming. Arctic permafrost, taiga permafrost is found in a region warming 3 to 4 times faster than anywhere else on the planet. This is a wonderful review paper published just a few years ago, kind of compiling and synthesizing permafrost temperature regimes from around the world. And so what I'm just showing you are temperature regimes over time as a function of mean annual permafrost temperatures on this axis. And I find this synthesis fascinating. It shows in general a real widespread global trend of this kind of decadal permafrost warming. There are periods of accelerated warming versus maybe slow down in some of that warming, but nonetheless, we have these persistent trends, but really showing a strong trend that some of the coldest permafrost in the Arctic is actually warming up the fastest. Okay, so all of these borehole temperatures, these lines in different colors, there is some variation in where those temperatures are recording down in the permafrost boreholes, but these are all relatively deep permafrost borehole records. So there's some really, really interesting variation from borehole to borehole. Some of it can be explained by location in the Arctic, and it really does highlight the fact that cold region permafrost is often most susceptible to warming and to change over time. Really, really fascinating trends coming out of this synthesis. So permafrost stores a lot of carbon. Around the Arctic, we have long-term evidence of permafrost warming, even at depth. And so we are really interested in the fate of that permafrost carbon pool. So this is a well-used cartoon of what I mean when I refer to the permafrost carbon feedback to climate. So we have an active layer on top of a permafrost soil or sediment, for example, that is in a region of the planet warming exceptionally fast relative to other regions on Earth. This is exposing more and more organic matter to thaw and microbial activity increasing can lead to carbon dioxide production under both aerobic or anaerobic soil conditions. Of course, the diffusional gradient for that greenhouse gas CO2 is up into the atmosphere. Under anaerobic conditions, which is not represented in this cartoon, we can also see the production of methane through microbial methanogenesis. And again, that diffusional gradient is upwards into the atmosphere. So the permafrost carbon feedback to climate is really a 2-carbon gas problem. I'm only going to be talking about CO2 and methane today. I'm not going to be talking about other greenhouse gases that we know are also influenced by permafrost thaw, including nitrous oxide. But even for carbon, we're really thinking about the dual role of CO2 versus methane, both important greenhouse gases. So what do we know about permafrost thaw and carbon release thus far? There's a lot of field-based evidence. There's a lot of experimentation, both in the field and the lab. And then we have a handful of what I like to refer to as permafrost-enabled Earth system models that have implemented gradual permafrost thaw, so really top-down surface permafrost thaw. This is a mechanism that exposes centimeters of surface permafrost thaw to warmer conditions and increased microbial activity over years to decades. So I'm going to call this process gradual permafrost thaw for the rest of my talk. So what we know from these model simulations is that warming of permafrost and permafrost thaw indeed does stimulate soil carbon losses. There is, however, a plant biomass offset. So as permafrost is thawing, we often see plants at the surface also responding, and we need to include those biomass offsets if we want to make predictions about net ecosystem exchange of carbon, which I think is very important. So there are some biomass offset mechanisms. Even still, permafrost thaw predictions into the future are globally significant. They are not as severe or worrisome as perhaps we were calculating or estimating 15 years ago. So that is good news from the scientific front. Yet these are still going to be globally significant emissions that we need to account for if we want to set policy targets to keep global warming under 1.5 degree thresholds, 2 degrees threshold. We do know that those plant biomass offsets not only reduce net ecosystem exchange, but push the accelerating permafrost carbon feedback to climate into the next century. So, media accounts of a permafrost bomb, impacting or playing out quickly through our climate, that notion is not been borne out by scientific evidence. This will be more of a gradual push on the climate system, again, accelerating into the next century. And there is some glimpses of good news. We have evidence from model scenarios that mitigation scenarios, RCP or emission scenarios that adhere more strongly to strict climate policy, that follow a pathway towards faster decarbonization, also help to keep some Arctic permafrost frozen, keeping that carbon in the ground. So climate mitigation and policy is definitely an important tool. If we want to keep Arctic permafrost frozen, the best tool at our society's disposal is decarbonization, without a doubt. But I do want to throw a caveat into this story, which is that there are no large scale, certainly no Earth system models currently simulating abrupt changes in permafrost thaw. So these changes, I will refer to them sort of generally as abrupt thaw mechanisms. And I'm referring here to thermokarst and thermal erosion, or anything that happens on the order of months to years, rather than those more decadal gradual thaw scenarios. And I'm going to show you some pictures of what abrupt thaw looks like. But this terrain tends to be associated with ice-rich permafrost. And so here on the left, we have a photo of Jamie Hollingsworth, the site manager for the Bonanza Creek LTER, who is holding up a permafrost peatland core. This is just a section of a core we pulled out from one of our field sites, and you can see this lovely, lovely section of pure ice that we've drilled into. You can just imagine what happens to this landscape when all of this material moves from frozen to liquid water. We start to see collapse of the soil surface because we see that that thaw of ice-rich permafrost really impacting deformation of this material. On the right is a really amazing, spectacular photo of a massive ice lens taken in the permafrost tunnel just outside of Fairbanks. Again, we rarely get to see glimpses of massive ice wedges from this perspective. I'm usually at the surface trying to drill down and find these things. Using corers, for example. So just a brilliant view of how big these ice wedges can get. Again, imagine when all of this material moves from a frozen state to a liquid state, what kind of havoc that is going to cause at the surface of the ecosystem. And here's what that looks like. So the ecosystems that I absolutely adore studying are permafrost peatlands, shown off at the edge of this photograph here. When permafrost is intact, these are relatively dry ecosystems. They are accumulating peat. We define them as peatlands, but you can walk across them in hiking boots and not get wet. It supports a stunted black spruce or larch community, dry ground cover communities of lichen or feather moss. But in years, sometimes even months, we can see a thaw edge and abrupt thaw convert that relatively terrestrial peatland community into a lake, into a semi-aquatic pond, certainly shifting that terrestrial community into moving through 100% mortality into a semi-aquatic or aquatic community, where we then see a new ecosystem that we refer to as collapsed scar wetlands or thermokarst lakes develop over time. And here's a bird's eye view of a landscape in the Northwestern Territories of Canada, showing again how these forested permafrost peatlands can start to be interrupted or fragmented by these semi-aquatic ponds and sloughs that then fill in and develop peat and its own vegetation over decades to centuries post-thaw. Eventually, all of these wet scapes in our permafrost peatlands actually coalesce, and we can see sudden turnover of the hydrology of these systems. This is happening now all across the southern portion of permafrost in Canada, where we're seeing regional state shifts in hydrology as these thaw features start to band together and coalesce and occupy a greater part of the landscape. So I am a peatland lover, and I am most familiar with those lowland landscapes, but abrupt thaw is certainly not limited to lowland environments. There are lots of researchers, lots of research groups focusing on abrupt thaw in more hill slope or high terrain environments. Just a few examples here. A thaw slump just outside of Norman Wells, Northwest Territory. And this is a really famous photograph taken by Steve Coquelle, I believe, of one of the mega slumps in the Peel Plateau region. So these different expressions can happen due to abrupt thaw in both lowland as well as upland environments. They can look extraordinarily different from one another, but they do share some common features, right? So abrupt thaw is always affecting meters of the soil column in relatively short amounts of time. That's the abrupt part of it. Material is often moving from a frozen state, of course, to an unfrozen state due to thaw, but it's also because of the nature of ice-rich permafrost moving from frozen to a saturated layer. In lowlands, that's because of sinking and subsiding in situ, but in uplands, it's often because erosion is pushing this material downslope into wetter valley bottoms or even into aquatic ecosystems like rivers. So this is a really complex system. There's a lot of different surface expressions. There's a lot of, different processes at play when I'm referring to this general term abrupt thaw. And yet we recognized, about a decade ago within the permafrost carbon network that this was a key uncertainty. We knew that abrupt thaw was increasing in its rate of change across the landscape, certainly occupying more land area across the landscape, and yet was not being represented in any large scale Earth system or climate model because it's complex and it's difficult to think about operationalizing a three-dimensional process into a very large-scale model that needs simplicity to some extent. And so we convened a working group within the Permafrost Carbon Network to try to create a variety of tools at our disposal to help fill in this gap. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of our latest work on that. So I am 100% a field researcher. I am not a modeler, but we decided to put a very simple inventory-based model together, again, to help provide kind of a conceptual fill a gap in between the field community that was really recognizing the importance of abrupt thaw and the modeling community. How could we sit in the middle to fill in between those two scientific spaces? So we approach this like any good ecologist would, right? We start with one ecosystem state. I'm just giving you one example of a scenario we modeled, which is permafrost peatlands. This is the system I know the best. When these systems thaw, they can move into a number of different successional trajectories, often moving through that very wetscape scale for some period of time, but then they continue to undergo ecological succession, accumulating a new vegetation layer, accumulating a new peat layer, and under some ecoclimatic conditions can actually reform permafrost. So we wanted to represent all of these successional dynamics in our abrupt thaw model. What we did is we used remote sensing data and records from the literature to put areas to each of these ecosystem states or boxes. And then we used remote sensing change detection studies or paleoecology reconstructions to label transition rates on these arrows, which represents the rate of change from one state to another. So when we do that, we can start to simulate rates of change of all of the different boxes, all of the ecosystem states in this model over time. And we're using some scenarios or some assumptions about rates of warming over time. We mimicked some RCP scenarios, for example. And again, I'm just showing you one example as an example, I guess, of the kind of output that this model can generate. So for example, you can start to say, all right, as permafrost is lost from this kind of landscape over time, what are the nonlinear relationships and trajectories of all of the different ecosystem states that depend on that rate of permafrost thaw? And you can see there's some really interesting dynamics over time with that flush of the wetscapes, happening early on, and then some of these more stabilized or older thaw features becoming more important later in the successional dynamic. So we repeated this same general approach, the same conceptual approach, not only for lowland peatlands, again, my passion, but for a few other generalized types of abrupt thaw, including flat lowlands that are more mineral bound. These are areas where abrupt thaw tends not to form peat accumulating environments, but rather thermokarst lakes would be the dominant expression. We also created a generalized abrupt thaw model for more hill slope terrains, which involves gullies and more of those erosional features. So I just want to take you straight to some kind of concluding remarks that, or findings that we had from this large effort that many people and colleagues contributed to over a period of about 6 or 7 years. The goal of this working group and the goal of this work was not to create the most realistic simulation of abrupt thaw. That was not our objective. Our objective was to answer this question. Relative to gradual thaw modeling scenarios, how important might abrupt thaw be? Is abrupt thaw going to be a small fraction because these are fine scale features on the landscape? Will abrupt thaw emissions not amount to the same order of magnitude of carbon emissions that the gradual thaw models are predicting? So when we try to compare model scenarios, apples to apples, between the gradual thaw models and what we were able to come up with in our simple abrupt thaw model, how do these compare to one another? So our study suggested that when you tally up those 3 generalized types of abrupt thaw, the flat lowland organic systems, the mineral lowland systems, and the more hill slope terrain systems, abrupt thaw from a simple carbon release perspective, so just a bean counting carbon perspective, releases about 50% of carbon in relation to the estimates that the gradual thaw models are coming up with. So about half of the carbon release estimates. And yet, we know that abrupt thaw is affecting certainly less than about 20% of the Arctic in terms of its proportional representation on the landscape. And so abrupt thaw features themselves are covering a very small amount of the landscape, but have the potential to emit up to half of the carbon emissions that are happening everywhere across the Arctic due to gradual thaw emissions. So we found this pretty interesting, defining abrupt thaw as a hotspot spatial mechanism of carbon release. But in our model, we were also able to track or account for CO2 versus methane release. And when we think about carbon emissions, not in terms of bean counting carbon release, but in terms of how do those carbon emissions influence climate, we used a number of different ways to think about radiative forcing. What we found is that abrupt thaw has a really high ratio of methane to CO2 release relative to gradual thaw. And so when you think about radiative forcing or climate impacts, abrupt thaw actually has the same impact on potential future climate relative to gradual thaw. So that actually really did surprise me. I was not expecting to see the role of methane play out across this abrupt thaw landscape as importantly as it did. And this is a model that includes biomass offsets, lake drainage, which reduces methane emissions over time. All of the ecological and biophysical mechanisms that lead to reduction in methane over time in these abrupt thaw features are accounted for in this model. It is possible we are not accounting for methane oxidation in just a general Arctic soil framework as much as we should. And so I do think this is an area for ongoing research, but the results to date show methane is a really important part of the story for the future of abrupt thaw. So I think that's an important take home. And of course, we don't care about permafrost only from a climate lens, only from a carbon lens. We care about permafrost for so many societal, cultural, and archaeological reasons. Permafrost is a preserver. Permafrost teaches us about our past. Permafrost is the glue of, building in the north and relying on northern lands. And these are just a few photos that are iconic and iconically used to demonstrate the impacts of permafrost thaw on northern ways of living. So there are a lot of reasons why we care about permafrost thaw, and I wanted to make sure I acknowledge that. And in fact, I am learning and growing as a scholar because my group is expanding, and my students are teaching me more about how we can think about permafrost within a cultural framework, and how do we think about permafrost within a social ecological system. I want to speak briefly to the work of Dr. Carolyn Gibson, who just defended her PhD a matter of a few months ago. Many of her articles are in press right now, so will be published soon. And she's really led the way or paved a path forward, at least in my group and amongst my colleagues, about truly thinking about permafrost hazards, thinking about abrupt ecological change within a cultural setting. She was able to work with Todd Brinkman's group and others at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in a NASA Above funded project, thinking about land users and the hazards that they face in interior Alaska. Carolyn was able to photo interpret or layer permafrost interpretations on some of the data collected within that project. What we found is up to 50% of the hazards faced by community members in a variety of villages and communities in interior Alaska, 50%, half of them have an ontogeny that we can relate back to permafrost. The community members may not recognize or may not associate those changes with permafrost. Again, permafrost is cryptic, it's buried, but we were able to layer our interpretation of landscape change on top of that. We believe strongly that permafrost research and the permafrost scientific community needs to think more strongly about centering knowledge co-production, community engagement in their work. And yet Carolyn has shown that the majority of permafrost measurements collected in both Canada and Alaska are nowhere near a northern community. And I believe strongly that community engagement and knowledge co-production starts with co-location of our science and co-location of our measurements. We are not currently doing that as a community, and that is something I hope we can all reflect on. I want to just take a winding trip in the few minutes that I have left with you. I've got about 10 minutes or so left with you. And I would normally love to shift into a discussion about how permafrost and fire are tightly coupled, and I am going to talk a bit about fire, but I want to talk about this within the lens of legacies. So I've already talked about the relationships between peat and permafrost. Peat protects permafrost. Permafrost conserves peat over time in a frozen matrix. There is a codependency and a co-relationship between these two types of material legacies that I find fascinating. What I want to do is layer on a story about wildfire. Both peat and permafrost provide resilience and resistance mechanisms within northern ecosystems that prevent these systems from burning severely. And we are starting to see an erosion of these relationships right before our eyes. Jill Johnstone and others at the Bonanza Creek LTER, Long-Term Ecological Research Program, funded here in the United States by NSF, have put forward a fascinating hypothesis about why Black spruce has this legacy lock on successional dynamics. Why is this such an important species here in North America? And I know that there are many who love to think about the dynamics of the tree canopy and population dynamics and the traits of Black spruce itself. But as the queen of peat on social media, I need to bring it back to the peat layer. We cannot understand the successional legacy lock of black spruce or any conifer forest, really, without thinking about how important peat is to that relationship. Black spruce is successful. It can regenerate immediately post-fire where there is a residual and relatively thick peat layer post-fire. If that peat layer is entirely consumed because of a drought, because of disturbance, because of an exceptional fire season, and mineral soil is exposed, that legacy lock of black spruce or conifers is lost. That legacy lock is eroded away, and we can see a shift towards this state shift towards a deciduous domain. I center peat in this story. Can peat survive that fire? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, then we are likely to see a response in the above ground community and perhaps an entirely different forest successional trajectory. We know from field evidence of rates of ground layer fuel combustion across hundreds of sites in Alaska. We've now repeated this kind of work in Western Canada. We know that ecosystems tend to burn more deeply in lots of different landscape settings later in the season. So when fires happen in August or September, when these ecosystems tend to be drier, the soils tend to be drier, that's when deep burning tends to occur, but not in our real strong wetscapes. These are permafrost domains. These are the real thick peatlands. These are, some of the North American boreal forests largest peatland complexes, often with permafrost. These landscapes, these wetscapes, appear to resist late season deep burning. So we know that permafrost or high water tables is providing these layers of resistance. And that makes a lot of sense. Combustion that hits a permafrost layer, hits a water table, is not going to be able to penetrate deeper. But there are some limits. So part of the resistance of these wetscapes is not just the soil and the frozen or saturated layer. It's also the relationship that permafrost has with ground cover vegetation. I can never get through a seminar without talking about sphagnum or the peat mosses. These are sponges on the landscape. They keep the soils cold. They are a legacy in themselves. They hold hundreds of units of water relative to their own body mass. And so these are important legacies and mechanisms, in part why those wetscapes can resist deep burning. But we're losing sphagnum cover across the boreal and across the Arctic because of shading due to shrubbification, due to drainage or drying. We're losing some of our important terrestrial sphagnum species because of permafrost thaw. So this is a legacy that is being eroded. We also know that land use that drains permafrost or peatlands, that reduces the water table, agriculture, road construction, any kind of human disturbance that creates an alteration of local to regional hydrology, even fringes of peatlands that are really susceptible to hydrologic change. These ecosystems have a disturbed hydrology, and they are extremely susceptible to deep burning. We've shown this in plots, for example, in an experimental context in Alberta, Canada, where these plots were drained for decades as part of a forestry or silviculture experiment. The government wanted to test whether they could develop a viable economic forestry sector in flat fen landscapes of central Alberta. That the answer was no. It was still very costly. So they abandoned these large-scale trench experiments I found them still draining peatland waters away from these plots. And some of these large-scale experiments had since burned during natural wildfires in Alberta. So I was able to document the interactions between drainage and wildfire. And it turns out any area of deep peat that has been drained, again, this is a human intervention, is extremely vulnerable to much greater depths of burning, so much greater carbon release relative to pristine or undrained hydrologic plots. You can, I mean, this is transferable information away from land use and human intervention and into the role of natural drying through climate change on peatlands, also increases the susceptibility of these systems to burning. So a variety, just a tour of different legacies that are being eroded. We know that's been happening in the boreal. There's an interplay between fire regimes, and we've been watching this for decades in the boreal. And then starting a few years ago, maybe evidence of a huge regime shift in at least Siberian, permafrost systems, with a very severe fire season in 2019 in Siberia, and also a repeat severe fire season in Siberia in 2020. Huge measured emissions of carbon, both CO2 and methane, from these fires. Absolutely a carbon surprise of the decade, if not longer. I think we are still trying to understand, what role permafrost has to play in these fires. Are we seeing the development of a new fire regime, or were these just anomalously bad fire years that maybe aren't repeatable? We don't know, and we won't have that context for some time. But what we do have the ability, and I just wanted to show you this with a kind of a snapshot image, we have this incredible ability to use remote sensing, to use fine scale remote sensing products to track the development of thermokarst in these burned areas over time. It is incredible, the technology that we have at our fingertips. We can see flaming, we can see smoldering, we can start to monitor thermokarst areas open up in response to these fires. We also know that there's some historic or legacy thermokarst or abrupt thaw features, clearly showing that this is a dynamic system that we have to track change over time. Fascinating time to be a northern person interested in permafrost and fire. So I have two conclusions of sorts. This is my scientific conclusion. I've talked about legacies, and I'd love to talk more with you after the seminar about legacies in your system, and are you seeing similar challenges? Legacies can slow down ecological change until they become compromised, and then we can see them pivot and lead to abrupt ecological change. So they can be lags or enforcers of abrupt change. And that is the reason why I find them fascinating. My one important take-home conclusion: abrupt change, whether it's abrupt change in permafrost or abrupt change in a more ecological context, it's not the same as gradual change sped up. This is not a dial that we can just say, oh, we'll just speed it up or slow it down, and we can use the same modeling tools or the same simulation tools to represent both gradual and abrupt change. They are distinct. Abrupt thaw, for example, can lead to extremely distinct ecological change that we will never see in the trajectory of a gradual thaw process. They are distinct. They need their own set of tools, their own monitoring systems, if we really want to understand these, certainly within management schemes and also within the climate system. And finally, I do want to leave you with an important Inuit word, sila. This is a word that communities, often impress upon us as we're talking about climate change and how it makes them feel in places in northern Canada where I am fortunate to do field work. Sila is not easily translated in English. It is often translated to mean weather, and that is not the meaning that I have taken from my conversations. Sila refers to connectedness. How people feel connected to their land and their water. Their land is their spirit. There is no separation. And I would like to offer this to you. We are communicating to one another today all around the world on Earth Day. We are connected through this concept of Sila. And that connectedness includes an atmosphere that we share that is going to be defined in the future by a changing Arctic and by changing permafrost. So I leave you with that concept of Sila, and I hope that can sort of enrich your Earth Day experience. And with that, I want to say thank you so much. I'm very happy to take questions, and feel free to reach out to me. If you're not able to slide your question in now, I'm always happy to chat afterwards. So thank you very much.